and financial advisory at NG. We have also Farai Kalunda, who's the manager for infrastructure at the African Development Bank for the Southern region. We have also Greg Ansermino, who's a partner at First Fund, Mitch France, who's principal for energy at the Net Bank, and of course our senior director, Ricardo, who you've already met yesterday. So to start off, Marcel, I'd like to call you up for your presentation.
Can you hear me? Okay, good morning everybody. My name is Marcel Bruweiler. I'm from the International Finance Corporation based in Joburg. I hope you had a good night here in beautiful Cape Town. A little bit of rain, which we need in Cape Town, as you know. There was a time where those Cape Town-based investors and bankers appreciated to have an opportunity to travel to Joburg from time to time so they could take a shower. This has now changed again. We are more stable, but it is testimony to infrastructure needs, which today's panel and topic we will explore further. So, IFC is the private sector development arm of the World Bank Group. We invest in and mobilize funds for private sector infrastructure projects, this to the tune of about $1 billion per annum in Africa. We, as the World Bank Group, recognize, of course, that those huge needs the infrastructure sectors of Africa have cannot be met by the public sector and official development assistance only. The gap is just too big, and there is no other way than to find opportunities and create markets for private sector investors if we want to achieve those development goals, including to have universal access to power. What we need to promote is commercial opportunities. And today or this morning, we will explore how we can potentially do this for energy storage systems and how we can, move this market, which is currently largely an equipment-based market, to a more contract-based or services-oriented market. As a matter of fact, yesterday when I was watching the beautiful sunset at Camps Bay, I was reflecting on the very interesting presentations we heard yesterday. But it occurred to me that we learned a lot on technology and options and electrolytes. It occurred to me that this battery storage market seems to be still largely driven by equipment suppliers and not so much by investors, which I find interesting and intriguing. So let's move into the subject, and let's first look a little bit at what you all know, and that is our reality in sub-Saharan Africa in terms of power supply. As you know, we have low access, on average around 40% in rural areas, much less, and we have 600 million people still without electricity. The grids are weak. On the right-hand side, you see a map of Africa's grids, and the dark spot at the bottom of the chart is Gauteng, which is kind of the center where the grid is strongest, but there are so many areas where the grid doesn't reach. And that grid is not only weak, it's also very unreliable. The World Bank did a survey in 2017 with companies across the continent, and it found that 78% of those companies said that they're suffering from up to 45 hours of electricity outages each month, leading, if I remember correctly, to on average about 8% of revenue loss for them. That's quite dramatic. That's quite dramatic. Last but not least, many of our grids are still thermal power based. So fossil fuels, comparably expensive. Not so much in the southern grids, in the SAPP region, which is largely hydro-based, but if you go to West Africa and parts of Central Africa, those grids are largely thermal-based and very, very expensive. So that's our reality, and now we need to see what we can do to change this, or how batteries can help address those challenges. And what the financiers will ask is essentially which applications are commercially viable and which applications do serve the needs of Africa best. You saw this chart, this pie chart yesterday in the presentation from Eskom. Credit goes to the Rocky Mountains Institute. So these are the 13 business models where batteries can be applied. I'm not going to go into the detail of this. It talks about from the so-called auxiliary services and the various options of frequency control to load shift, etc. So a couple of thoughts of how this, or which would be the most relevant for Africa. Of course, we have an emerging commercial and industrial consumer business, largely through PV. In South Africa, I heard a figure the other day that there's already about 180 megawatt of solar PV installed on South African rooftops. Now, this right now is still suboptimal because those batteries, those PV panels cannot feed back into the grid. But more and more, I think the opportunity for batteries will also pose itself to commercial and industrial consumers, not only in South Africa, but possibly also in sub-Saharan Africa. Then we can talk about off-grid applications, and essentially the replacement of diesel power in remote areas with captive clients like mines, which suffer from very, very high cost of power. And this can not only serve those clients, it can also serve the utilities, because they might be able to defer grid investments to certain areas if they can put generation at those remote nodes of the, in many cases, radial grid of Africa. So grid stability, T&D deferrals is an option which utilities can consider when they deploy batteries. Then the big question, what can be done in terms of support the integration of more renewable energy into Africa's grids? And we heard a lot from Eskom about that yesterday. The questions whether we should do storage on grid level or whether it could be deployed at the level of IPPs need to be explored. What are the pros and cons with regards to that? How can PV load shift cheap power, which in many countries we have a surplus of during the night, particularly in South Africa, where the coal base load is not fully utilized during the night, and use that cheap power during the night to charge batteries and shift the load to the evening peak, where in many countries, including here, thermal peakers are being deployed. So then I put that chart on the top right here. These are the tariffs of SAPP, the so-called day-ahead market, where the utilities in Southern Africa and also some private clients trade surplus power on a daily basis. And the red line on top is the peak, and the bottom is the off-peak. And the differential in the SAPP grid is currently around 7 US cents. Now, in other markets, the differential between peak and off-peak is much larger. This is testimony to the large hydro base we have in Southern Africa. So one can ask, if the differential is only 7 cents, can you do an arbitrage model at 7 cents at this state already today, or do subsidies need to come in? So, what are the key considerations for energy storage in Africa, and what should we explore in the panel this morning? As I said, is what we currently have in terms of prices for batteries already commercially viable? Or do we need some sort of a blending through subsidies with commercial money or grants to make them viable? This is probably different from market to market. What are the regulatory uncertainties and the regulatory risks investors are facing? Is the framework for batteries developed enough? Do we have grid codes? To what extent would net metering help? And what are the other enabling factors which possibly we as a World Bank group could also help with to help utilities and governments to set enabling frameworks to attract more investments in the space? One concern financiers often have when they invest in infrastructure in Africa, particularly in power, is that they need an off-taker. So Africa's markets are not deregulated. We have single buyer markets only. So that means the main credit risk of any long-term contract is the credit risk of the off-taker. And we have many weak off-takers on the continent. So we don't want to burden weak off-takers with tariffs which they cannot recover from the consumers. How to deal with that? That's another challenge. And how to then structure those revenue streams to make them attractive for investors so they can invest long-term, and I mean long-term in terms of battery life between 10 and 20 years. Last but not least, those technologies, are they really bankable at this stage? I mean, looking forward to hear from our commercial bankers on the panel. Would they bank an equipment supply guarantee or a 10-year warranty from the suppliers which are currently in the market? Are the contractors and the O&M operators we have experienced enough to achieve bankability in the already very difficult financing environment in sub-Saharan Africa? And do we have enough visibility of those life cycle costs and efficiency and the degradation figures to bank batteries on a standalone project finance basis? We know it has been done in certain instances, but we don't have quite the necessary visibility yet in Africa, I would venture saying. So, I'm coming to an end, and to prompt the panel, you know what this is, huh? It's the Loch Ness monster in Scotland. So not that I think that the batteries are a monster of any sort, but yes, those batteries are expected to be huge, but till date, still largely invisible on the African continent. So how to commercialize those storage opportunities for Africa, and how to look at the opportunities and the challenges the market poses, that is the topic of this morning's panel. So over to you, Wendy.
Thanks very much, Marcel. This is working, yes? Good. Good morning, everybody. I think Marcel has given us a really nice overview of some of the issues that we can cover today in the discussion on financing. To get started, I'm going to ask each panelist to say a little bit about their firm or organization so that you have a sense of the perspective that each panelist is bringing to this discussion. And I'll also give them each one question to start with. After that, we will go into questions from the audience, and I think as you ask questions, it would be really helpful for everyone if you just say who you are and where you come from, because I think the perspective is also useful for the panelists when they're responding. So to get started, I'm going to start with Mitch. Coming from the commercial banking world, I think one of the questions that Marcel posed and something that we're all considering is this or can this be commercially viable? So at one level, perhaps it's not very different from anything else that commercial bank has tried to lend to. So maybe, Mitch, you could just talk a bit about the considerations you look for when you're considering whether or not to finance a storage project. Also, I'd be interested to hear from you whether you see there are already parts of the market where it is commercially viable, storage, where you think it's not, and some ideas on what could be done to help it move in the direction of commercial viability. So if you start off just by letting us know where you're coming from and that perspective, that would be great. Thanks, Mitch.
Hello. Hi, thank you, Wendy, for the introduction. My name is Mitch Brandt, and for those who don't know me, I'm from Nedbank. Nedbank is one of the 4 largest banks in South Africa, and proud to say that we currently have the largest portion of debt funding in the renewable energy program in South Africa. And we have a strong mandate from our board to support renewable energy projects in South Africa. And we've been very active in the South African market on the REAP program. And we have also, I think, one of the only banks who've funded all the different renewable energy technologies under the renewable energy program. And we are obviously keen to look at how the market is developing for the storage, because we see that as one of the disruptive technologies in renewable energy going forward. And as we heard in the last few days, there's a lot of technology developments and OEMs and a lot of focus in terms of getting this renewable energy storage as part of the bigger energy mix and the energy security. So coming back, Wendy, on the question of where we are in terms of bankability, I think Marcel set the scene in terms of where we are currently. For us as non-recourse debt providers, we see the market in 2 parts. One is grid connected and one is a more embedded generation. Nedbank obviously is active on both markets and are looking how we can provide senior debt or non-recourse funding in these. But where we stand currently from a Nedbank perspective, I think there are a few challenges still open to get the energy storage portion part of a commercialized or a bankable type of technology which we would look at to support. And to just break down that in a bit more detail, firstly, I mean, the most important part of non-recourse funding is a PPA. We haven't seen any PPAs currently which are bankable, and I'm specifically talking about South Africa. I hear there's a lot of work being done in other parts of the world in terms of getting PPAs bankable. But the most important for us is to look at the revenue streams. And what we've heard yesterday typically is in terms of battery storage, there's a lot of energy stacking or revenue stacking in terms of the PPA, which makes it difficult for banks in terms of predicting what the revenue streams would be over a longer type of period. So typically on that, we would like to see some type of capacity payment, which makes for the availability of the storage system, and then we will have to look at what the other revenue streams are in terms of the risk, the sustainability, and the longer term period on how they can be derived for the project. Then also, I think Marcel touched on to the risks of the whole market currently is driven by the equipment suppliers who do a lot of research and have a lot of applications. And I think the market is not mature yet in terms of how the battery storage system will, come up to the challenge in terms of what the end user actually requires. I think Eskom's got a very good program, which is a demo program going in terms of how energy storage will, penetrate the market and can be used on a large utility scale. There's a number of demo projects as well, which we heard yesterday from big players and equipment suppliers in terms of smaller scale, looking at mini grids and see how that can be integrated together with other technologies like PV. And then from a commercial perspective, at the end of the day, we need to get certainty in terms of the capex and the construction and the timelines. And we also need to get certainty in terms of how these projects will be operated. So we'll be looking at the big players and which have strong balance sheets and credit ratings to kick off the process. And also, we need to make sure that we have visibility and understanding of the longer term risks of the batteries in terms of degradation, how they will be used, and what the risks are of maybe replacing these batteries before they get to whatever is predicted in terms of their lifetime. So that's just in short to kick off the discussion.
Yep. Let me turn also to Greg now, who is also coming from the commercial financing angle. Companies specifically focusing on financing renewable and, to some extent, small-scale renewables. So, Greg, one of the things which is really front and center with storage, and particularly battery storage, is the already fast-changing technology and costs and the expectation that that change is going to continue. So I'm wondering, from that perspective, how do you take that into account when you are evaluating funding proposals? Do you see a change in the kind of proposals? This issue of cost and technology change, how does that? How do you think about that when you're looking at funding decisions?
Okay, so just to introduce first, to start with, first is a public-private partnership between the German taxpayer and South African commercial banks, and KfW has given us some of our funding and effectively equity in the fund, and RMB provides some of the senior funding, although we'll be bringing other funders on board. And FIRST was set up originally to address the fact that the South African government small project IPP program, the bidders couldn't access funding. When it happened, there was a perception that a 5 megawatt solar project was not fundable, despite the fact that it had all the kind of bells and whistles of a REAP project. Interesting thing is, 5 years down the line, I think that the perception will be completely different. Is that the market's become much more familiar with solar, that the prices have come down, so the economics are more sustainable, and the banks will start to look at the type of projects that we are specifically set up to do, funnily enough. And it talks to perception, which is a lot of the time the lack of appetite for technology is around perception rather than reality. And I think batteries is going to fit into that category, which is challenge on a lot of the renewables is the life of the plant far exceeds the credit tenor that the buyer can achieve. So if you look at South African corporates, and this is very specific to the South African market, as opposed to the rest of the subcontinent, can borrow for, say, 8 years quite easily. A solar plant, wind plant has got a life way beyond that. So how do you amortize it? Because your buyer doesn't see the benefit. The buyer says, I want to see, against my budget, the first 3 years, my total energy bill. And you're going to have the same issue with batteries, is when you start to integrate it, the buyer's going to say, show me the benefit, I want to see the benefit immediately. And what we will see is the same things, I think, as what's happened in a lot of other technologies, mobile, solar, wind, is that the battery technology will get increasingly efficient and increasingly more cost-effective in terms of just through scale in the production of batteries. The batteries are going to become more kind of use-specific so that they'll be more efficient in what they use. So the challenge for the financier becomes, we use old-fashioned systems, which is to say, we put the finance available based on what is, and you commit to that. If there's stuff that you can replace over time that's more efficient, come and talk to us, and we will restructure it. And one thing in that space, I think, is where the suppliers of the technology can make a big difference, which is if you look at most large industrial plant, you start to develop a secondary market for more obsolete equipment where it's coming out of more environments that don't require that level of efficiency. And if we start to see the ability to recycle plant into secondary markets, recycle batteries into secondary markets, so that where consumers who have the requirement for a very, very, very high quality of power, people running robotics, people running tech hubs, that sort of thing, will be prepared to pay for the risk replacement, then those kind of batteries can be then reallocated into markets where it's less efficient. And those are the types of things where I think technological change will become naturally. I don't think it's a real risk. I think it's a perceived risk, and the market will sort it out naturally. We've seen it in mobile. The smartphone changed the way people saw handsets. And we've seen that in a lot of the renewables is some renewable technologies, purely because of their scale, have become irrelevant. You know, CSP, it was heralded as this kind of wonder alternative. It gave you a longer lifetime, daytime, intraday kind of production profile. But it's turned out to be, particularly kind of solar tower, it's become questionable. And the problem with it, you're locked into long-term technology. So I think that, from a financing perspective, I'm very excited about batteries. I think they can make a big difference. The question is, how do you fit them into the cost, because it's got to work cost effectively, and how do you deal with obsolescence? And obsolescence is not about throwing things away. It's about flexibility. We've seen that in the design of the lithium-ion batteries, the banks, is those can be upgraded over time by the replacement of units. And these sorts of things become just normal everyday issues for financiers. I don't see it as anything different than any other space that is technology driven.
Great. Thanks, Greg. Disney. Still from the private sector perspective, but a slightly different perspective coming from an electricity service provider, actually a company that I think is really at the forefront of technology and business model innovation. So great to have you talk about this relatively new topic. One of the things that came out from Marcel's presentation, he mapped it out nicely, and from earlier in the workshop, is the fact that storage can serve multiple purposes. It has multiple value streams, moving supply to meet peak demand, dealing with network congestion, helping with voltage fluctuations. How do you factor that in from the perspective of an electricity supplier? Do you see all those values, all those value streams, and how do you factor that in when you're thinking about investing in storage?
Okay, good morning. Thanks, Wendy. I'm going to start off by introducing ENGIE 4 years ago. When I joined the company, I would introduce myself as someone from GDF Suez, for those of you who don't know the history of ENGIE, but more importantly, that this was the world's largest IPP, measured in the number of megawatts installed. Today, when I introduce ENGIE, I talk about the company as an energy solutions provider. That transition from a large, what was then considered a utility, because we also did gas distribution, to an energy solutions provider has been facilitated by technology, and in particular, the digitization of technology. 4 years ago, I was also very excited. ENGIE had just been awarded preferred bidder on its first CSP project. That technology at the time was innovative technology, but it was also very risky technology, and the lenders around the room here will tell you. Assessing that risk and properly pricing for that risk was indeed quite a challenge. A week ago, we were asking ourselves the question, should we still be banking on CSP technology for storage, or should we be banking on battery and hydrogen for storage? And that all happened in a space of just 4 years. So technology has done a lot to evolve this company. And as an IPP, or a technology solutions provider, or energy solutions provider, and I say this also to the lenders in this room who are still looking at the problem from the perspective of project finance, for the government institutions in this room that are saying, how do we create the right regulatory environment? On this continent, we have to choose. Are we going to be innovators, early adopters, or are we going to be followers? We miss a lot of opportunity because we very often come in as followers. That means we have to buy, pay for, and use the technology, as opposed to developing, not just developing and innovating, but also creating the manufacturing, the jobs, those opportunities that come with taking the leadership role in that technological development and advancement. So for ENGIE, we see storage as an energy solution to our end consumer. So I'm no longer talking about megawatts anymore. I'm looking at the customer and I'm saying, what are your challenges? And how do we use technology to overcome those challenges? When you start to ask that question and you embrace the possibilities, the issue or the question of risk becomes, we're doing this, How do we now manage and mitigate the risk, as opposed to, ooh, what are the risks? Your approach then changes. You are more solutions focused, and I promise you the ideal funding structure to suit the opportunity, not the problem, to suit the opportunity becomes more and more apparent. And that discourse, I think, is starting to happen. We're certainly having it with our partners in banking. Coming to your question of where is the value, we heard yesterday, it depends. It depends on the system. It depends on the challenge we are trying to overcome, the problem we are trying to solve. I think that the issue of the technology being the solution is no longer an issue. Yesterday, Felicity and the other ladies were saying the technology is here. It has arrived. How do we enable it in our systems so that we address the 600 million people in Africa that still do not have access to electricity? How do we address that problem? And it's no longer an issue of technology. Indeed, it's an issue of regulatory environment and, of course, coming up with the right funding structure. And you know, I was saying to somebody yesterday, when I got my first laptop, it was about $3,000, and I had the choice between buying a laptop and getting a second-hand car. The boys around me were like, I think you should get a second-hand car. I looked at the opportunity that the laptop would create. Yes, it was a huge investment from the perspective of an undergraduate student. But it allowed me not only to do my homework, to do my assignments in the comfort of my own home, avoid waiting for a bus to get to campus in the middle of winter. It allowed me to find alternative sources of income, such as typing up dissertations for PhD students, while my friends who had the car were going out pub hopping. It allowed me to graduate one semester earlier than those who had suggested I spend that money on a car. There are trade-offs. And we have to choose what is important, not just for us, but for the next generation.
Thank you, Tessa. That opens up a bunch of new things, which I'm sure will be picked up in the questions. But I think it's moving now actually to sort of the other end of the scale of finances, moving to the international financial institutions. We heard that there are still sort of the fundamentals that have to be met when financing is being considered, and although we're moving in the right direction with storage, perhaps not completely there. So I think there's everybody will agree that there's a role for development finance institutions, and I'm going to ask Farai now if he can talk a little bit about the perspective from African Development Bank. It doesn't really need an introduction to this, to the organization, to this audience, but how do you see storage happening on the African continent, and what is African Development Bank thinking about how to position and support that?
Good morning, everyone, and thank you for this opportunity to discuss this very important topic. So, indeed, you said perhaps there's no need to introduce the bank, but maybe briefly let me just, for the benefit of those that might not know the African Development Bank, we are a bank owned by the 54 African countries and 29 regional countries. We focus mainly on infrastructure development, and our strategy does speak to that, as well as private sector development. And I think that's a very important piece of the puzzle. I think our president says there is no development from aid. In other words, Africa will not develop from aid, but we need to ensure that we develop our private sector. We develop viable solutions for Africa, so that we for us to realize that development, we need viable solutions. So, in terms of the subject that we are discussing today, I think it's also important just to mention that our strategy in the energy sector is driven by the New Deal on Energy. And the New Deal on Energy talks about 160 gigawatts of new generation by 2025. It talks to 75 million off-grid connections and 150 million connections by 2025, and all this to realize universal access by 2025. I think one of the key issues is when we talk to access, we also talk of it as uninterrupted. I think that's a very important thing to note. And for that to be achieved, we are really looking at storage, also providing that backup to ensure that you have a reliable and an uninterrupted supply of energy. So what the bank has done is we have various interventions that through which we get involved in the energy sector. We have largely 4 or 5 main streams. So the first stream would be your grid-connected renewable energy stream. We also have an off-grid renewable energy stream. We have project preparation as part of this. And we do have investment in private equity and debt funds that we do. So this is all in trying to ensure that we put out resources that can and will drive energy development on the continent. So specifically, perhaps let me just break that down so that it makes a bit more sense in terms of actual initiatives that we have or we are currently implementing. We have what we call the off-grid revolution, and the idea is to develop green mini-grids and solar home systems, and also to provide TA support for that to happen. I think one of the main things that we are realizing is we need our private sector to be involved. And when it comes to green mini-grid, there's still, let me call it an information gap, or there's still a misunderstanding, or there's need to help the private sector develop the right business models for the green mini-grid revolution to take off. We are partnering with the Sustainable Energy Fund for Africa, which is an in-house fund that we have, which hosts this green mini-grid revolution, green mini-grid revolution, and they also run a website where there is information available for developers, for funders, for governments, for utilities to go in and identify and use that resource in developing their projects. We are also working on what we call the Distribution Energy Companies Financing Program. And the idea for this particular one is to ensure private sector development and private sector participation again in the distribution of energy. And part of the resources are really meant to buy down the cost of developing projects. We have an initiative which has been recently launched where we are trying to, we want energy companies to bid for subsidies. I think when you're looking at when one looks at distribution energy companies, there's always a challenge in the final tariff. So we have looked at various models which say, okay, maybe we should be doing a results-based approach to it, where a company must prove that they've done so many connections and then get a subsidy out of that. But the challenge is always then that you tend to pay more. So to get around that, the approach we are now taking is to get all these energy companies in an identified scheme to bid for the subsidy they would require to make their projects viable. That way, I think at the end of the day, the subsidy scheme will not pay as much as doing it the other way around. So we have this Distribution Energy Companies Financing Program, which we are rolling out together with the EU. And it is receiving, or it's funded from blended finance through the EU window. And the other part that I think in everything we are trying to do is to make sure that there is local commercial bank involvement in the projects that we do. Like I said, it's about private sector development. It's about empowering the countries. It's about empowering the private sector to do projects on their own. So we have, just as an example, in Zambia, we have a program whereby we are given an opportunity for local lenders to come in and finance projects, normally in the 5 to 7 year period, which they are comfortable with. And the bank then is providing an extension of the tenor from years 7 to 15 if the local banks are not comfortable in operating there. So again, I think without that instrument, local banks wouldn't normally participate, or if they do, then it means the tariff will be very high. So we have that program done in Zambia, and we want to roll it to other countries to ensure adequate participation of the local financial institutions. One of the other programs that we, in fact, sorry, still under the distribution and energy companies, we have a project in DRC which has recently been launched. It's a pilot for 3, perhaps be somewhere between 5 to 10 megawatt, but 3 power plants that are solar, and we'll have solar is about 15 to 20 in that range for the 3 of them. But they also have a battery storage, so it's a hybrid system with the battery storage. Perhaps the last initiative that I just wanted to talk about is the Desert to Power initiative, which we have across the Sahel region. The idea is to do up to 10 gigawatts of solar, and obviously storage will play a part at some level. And the target is to electrify or to connect up to 250 million people, of which about 90 million of them will be on off-grid, right? So I think the first project under this Desert to Solar project is the one in Burkina Faso, which we are currently working on. Again, the idea is to do about 70 megawatts of solar with up to 50 megawatts 50 megawatts of battery installed. It will be both grid and off-grid, we have one of the funds that we have used or that we intend to use to fund, especially the private sector portion of this, is a fund that we created, which is called the Facility for Energy Inclusion. It's a $500 million fund, of which the bank has put in 100 million, 50 for the actual project development, and then 50 for financing investments. And we also have, towards the end of last year, it was actually the first cycle or the first round of that fund was actually closed, and it's now in a position to disburse. And this project or this fund really targets, I think, what Greg was referring to, those very small projects, 1, 5, 10 megawatt at most projects, total investment cost in the region of 20 to 25 million. And as well as part of that Facility for Energy Inclusion, we also have a green mini-grid window, again, to encourage private sector participation in the green mini-grid sector to assist with the project preparation and also provide advice. We also do then provide advice for the various, especially on the government side, through our Africa Legal Support Facility. So we have quite a number of initiatives that we are trying to pull together, or we are pulling together to support the development of renewable energy on the continent. Thank you.
Thanks, Roy. About the $1 billion financing that the World Bank is committing to try and catalyze the battery storage market. together with the idea to mobilize a lot more financing from other development and commercial sources. So where do you see the demand for this kind of investment coming from? And also, perhaps, Ricardo, you could just touch on what the World Bank and others in our space can do to help make the battery storage market more commercial.
A big thank you. First of all, it's great to be here. Let me start a little bit far, and then I will get to answer that. Last year, more or less in this period, we were, at least I was seeing, that Tesla was about to complete their about 200 megawatt hour storage plant or storage facility in Western Australia. It looked so exotic. And now we are all here in Cape Town discussing, well, what can we do in batteries? And there are 200 people here. I have to say, it's incredible, the trip that we have done in 12 months. I don't want to think that the World Bank is at the very, very edge of technology. There are companies that do technology. There are big companies like ENGIE that have the money, the resources, the utilities to do something like that, or the energy provider, as you rightly said. I know many of the utilities that like to think in that way, which I think is logic. It's very, very logic. So 12 months ago, I was still looking at Tesla. In June last year, the World Bank was asked to look at a coal-fired project in Europe. And we say, well, I mean, in Europe, in the middle of it, it's a little bit of an old technology. Is it the right choice? Let's see what we can do. So we had a big study done, and it came out, I mean, we are in the middle of Europe, so you are reasonably well connected to other countries, that a combination of grid connection, regional integration, some of the existing coal, plus a lot of renewables, plus batteries, would give that particular country clean, affordable, and secure energy. I remember, I go by heart, that the total storage capacity we were thinking about was about 300 megawatt hour. And I remember, since I had to sign off on that document, how uneasy I was sleeping at night. I say 300 megawatt hours. This is huge. I mean, Australia was 200, around 200 by Tesla. Are we really proposing a solution which is not a nowadays solution, is a solution of the future? Then we end up 8 months later, 9 months later. I know it's California. I know very well. I mean, I'm not trying to compare oranges and apples here. Well, I'm trying to compare oranges and apples. Because anyway, it's all fruit. So what I want to say, you see, I was in Italy, I'm Italian, I was in Rome in December. I was going for the Christmas holiday, so I stopped by Enel. And they told me, well, you know, we are bidding at the moment in California for storage for 2,500 megawatt hour. So hey, the world is moving very, very, very fast since I was used to the 200 megawatt hours of Tesla. So where do we stand at the moment? The World Bank at the moment has several projects. I have to say, I will come to Africa in a moment. But certainly it is it's great because we invested together with ESMAP, our trust fund. We invested a lot of money and resources, and I see a lot of people who worked on it around in the first line, around these. And so we have a big project already of 300 million in China with one of the regional utilities for batteries and storage. And it is incredible to see that actually nowadays we can talk about these and we can move it together with the investor. We have a big project, but these are all projects that are about to be closed. We are not talking about we just started; they are about to be completed. Another big one in India, again, solar and storage. So actually, what 1 year ago looked so exotic, Western Australia, Tesla, Elon Musk, well, It is not so exotic nowadays. It is going there. Now, I have to say, when Mitch was talking, I was sympathizing a lot because I come from that world. I have to say, I come from investment banking, probably more than commercial, but it's the same kind of thinking. And I agree. I mean, it's a matter of revenues. I have a balance sheet. I don't want to screw up my balance sheet, so I have to make sure that all risks are properly mitigated and the perspective of sustainability, meaning economic and financial sustainability, is there. So I think that we are, especially in Africa, we are in a moment where we have to put together 3 pieces of this puzzle. And this is where I come to the $1 billion facility, which is already $2 or $3 billion at this point. I cannot even control it. We have to educate, because the truth of the matter is that, here we are speaking among converted. We are like in a big mass and we all think the same. So, but there are a lot of policymakers, there are a lot of companies, a lot of local utilities, a lot of domestic and international investors that need to be educated. How does it work? And I have to say, I'm a civil engineer, so for me it's all new, the same. So I have to say, something, the kind of event we're having today is key to explain that we walked a long way from Elon Musk and the 200 megawatt hour in Western Australia. But education is key, to educate the policymakers, to educate the utilities, to educate various actors. Then the other thing is to put together the conditions. I don't think the conditions are there to go into a really kind of non-recourse scheme. I found it's early to do that. And also it's quite early to go into equity with the risk that it takes, even though equity is there to take more risk. But I have to say, I think we are there already for corporate finance. I mean, look at Eskom, this 1,440 megawatt hour, I believe, that is being developed. So I think that this is the first wave of what we will see. We will see big utilities, more or less financially viable, but that they will move into the space as little by little that the engineers are equipped with the right notions. And I think that the work by the equipment providers in this moment is huge, because the equipment providers are key to show what are the potentiality of this technology. Last but not least, so we need the right policy making, we need concessional financing. So the story of and I finished, so I got there at the end. It was all around the world, from Australia to California. But the reason why we started with this big facility is that we realized last year that we had around $1 billion in batteries projects or batteries related projects. So, and by the way, there are around $2.5 billion that we have in batteries-related projects in the project pipeline. So it's moving very, very quick. So we said, okay, how can we scale it up? How can we make sure that we accelerate the deployment of batteries? Batteries are not there. Let's accelerate the deployment. So what can we do? Well, first of all, we have to dedicate funding and resources to education, funding and resources to educate also the governments on policy making, on the right legal and regulatory framework. We will have to have some projects. The first of them will probably be done on a kind of public basis, but we want to move very, very, very quick to private. And above all, we want to make sure there is enough concessional financing at the very beginning, subsidies, if you want to call it, but to make sure that the technology is going to roll out very, very quick, or as quick as possible. We are not ashamed of that. Think about solar, think about telecoms. I mean, all new nascent technologies have benefited from feed-in tariffs or any other things. So this is our plan. So our plan is to have at least, but it's going to be more obviously, 1 billion of our money for financing of batteries related projects, both on grid and off grid. And we are getting around other 3 billion in concessional financing from bilateral donors, from other IFIs, and so on and so forth. Of course, all of these will be blended with commercial financing as soon as this is deemed possible. So this is the idea, this is where we came from, and that's what we're trying to do.
Thank you, Ricardo. Right, so I think this has given you a good perspective on who's up here on the panel and some of their thinking and the issues that they're concerned with. So let's open it up now to the floor. I think we'll take several rounds of questions, and then if you would like to direct it to a specific panelist, please feel free. If you would like an open question and each panelist who has something to say about it can respond, that's fine. When you ask the question, please remember to say who you are and where you're coming from. So I saw one hand in the back there. Please go ahead.
Good morning, everybody. Thank you very much for your time today. My name is Archer Kilpatrick. I work for Actis, a private equity firm. We're one of the larger investors here in South Africa in the Renewables IPP program. The question is predominantly for Ricardo, though possibly also for Marcel. We heard an excellent presentation yesterday from Felicity Jones on the UK example where procurement was done by National Grid through a tender process. It was 8 times oversubscribed by developers bringing projects forward. I'd just like to hear a little bit around the decision here in South Africa that the procurement's been done by Eskom procuring directly from equipment suppliers, and whether there's a desire going forward that these procurement processes supported by the World Bank would be encouraging developers and investors to come forward, or whether you see this being held within this corporate model for a bit longer.
Well,
Ricardo, we take a few questions and then we can cover them. Sorry. One more question here. Yep.
Good morning. I'm Henry van Esveld from Energy Partners, a local company trying to sell alternative utilities in South Africa. We've got a track record with solar PPAs that's been quite successful, but we've recently started with microgrids, trying to implement PPAs with that. The interesting thing that I've seen, and it was, I think Mkhulu mentioned it yesterday, is that a lot of these developments in battery storage might take place in commercial, residential, and electric vehicles, which is something else, but in that space, not necessarily with these big implementations. So what we tend to see is that the financier, who in our case at Energy Partners wants to be us, we want to finance these projects and sell the electricity. We tend to try and develop partnerships with the property developer who's actually creating the infrastructure, because especially in what we've seen in South Africa, these opportunities are best on the financial side when there's new infrastructure being developed, where there is no grid and there is electrification that's necessary, and we can develop a model that, that suits all parties involved. I would like to hear a little bit of whether these strategies of investment involves these infrastructure developments as well as just the battery projects.
Thank you. Maybe a couple more and then we go to the panel. Sure, please go ahead.
Hi, I'm Rahul Walawalkar with India Energy Storage Alliance and Global Energy Storage Alliance. I have a question regarding energy storage technologies. Now we have seen number of projects where storage technologies are commercially deployable, but one of the challenges which is being faced is that there are some solutions which are, say, building large transmission projects, sometimes get really long-term 20-25-year financing under World Bank or other intergovernmental schemes, whereas storage projects, number of times the private investors are expected to have payback periods of 3 years or 5 years. So there is a big discrepancy which ends up getting created on what solutions can get deployed based on the availability of the financing. And we have seen this also in past with areas like energy efficiency. So are there any learnings from some of the past experiences in other relevant sectors which can be applied for energy storage segment to fast track deployment and not create this discrepancy with some other longer term financing for alternate technologies?
Thank you. Maybe one more, and then there is one more. Let's go with these. Thank you. One more question, and then I'll ask the panel, some of them specific, more others more broad.
Good morning, everyone. Paolo De Michelis from Global Ec. We are a long-term investor in the power sector in Africa. My question to the panel is really around project financing benchmarks that you've seen perhaps outside of Africa, or in Africa if possible. I understand that the first deals are getting done in the US, Germany. Obviously it's innovative, but I'd like to understand where we've seen comparable transactions. Thank you.
Thanks. So let's turn now to the panel. There were several questions. Ricardo, one of them was specific to you, and then ask the rest of the panel to jump in on the others.
I will start first. I mean, first of all, I expect on the project we're doing with ESCOM is that ESCOM will do the procurement. The World Bank Group, so together with IFC, we have this very successful kind of program called Scaling Up Solar. So how to help governments in procuring out or tendering out for solar projects. Well, this program has already moved to a large extent to scaling up solar plus batteries. For example, this has already been done in Madagascar, where we procured not only the megawatt of solar, but also the megawatt hours of batteries. So I would expect, of course I'm not sure because it takes two to tango certainly, but I would expect that several governments will request the World Bank Group to support in the tender process, to optimize the tender process and to design the tender process for batteries. And I would think that something similar to that may happen in South Africa, but I leave it to Marcel maybe a little bit more.
Mm.
Thanks. I don't know, Marcel, if you want to speak to that point.
So, I mean, the dynamics in the South African market, as you all know right now, are quite complex. So, I mean, we are approaching an election. We are all waiting for issuance of a long overdue integrated resource plan, which is going to determine the roadmap. We have heard a minister saying that he wants to renegotiate the round 1 and 2 IPPs, so there's a lot at play. Now batteries can greatly influence what all these things are, which are currently in the pipeline, are going to happen. So, I mean, I'll give you one example. I mean, South Africa has been contemplating to put in 3,000 megawatt of LNG to power as the next big procurement program with renewables. I'm not sure to what extent South Africa will still need 3,000 megawatt of LNG to power in 5 years. It really depends how batteries develop. Now, South Africa has a very sophisticated grid, so this is not, the Central African Republic in terms of its access and its sophistication. So, whether to put storage at IPP level or at grid level is a question which one I think should debate depending on what the qualities of the grid are. But those batteries, they pose great opportunities for the existing IPP sponsors. You know, we have more than 100 renewable energy projects which have successfully been financed, are mostly on grid now in South Africa. These plants could be repowered, the quality could be improved, and those plants could sell essentially under their existing PPAs. One idea which has been contemplated that in the context of a refinancing of early renewable energy IPP rounds, why not throw batteries in as an option to enhance the quality of that power of the early REIPP rounds? So I think we're going to see a lot of interesting developments in the next couple of months in that space, and I'm looking forward to also get more clarity from the authorities on where the journey goes.
Thanks, Marcel. So maybe some of the other questions. There was one on learning from other sectors and a specific question on a type of project development concept. Anybody like to speak to those?
Well, just to pick up on the comments there, I think a lot of what we've seen in a lot of our solar portfolios, we've got very similar things that we're financing at the moment, is they look at it, it's easy to put into the new developments, it's integrated into the cost. But I think batteries offer something slightly different, which is a lot of your big residential developments, retail developments, the consumer's on a block tariff, so that when you look at the comparable cost of your renewable energy, it's a marginal tariff and it's not affected by time of use. What batteries do, they still have a relevance there, obviously, but it's much more relevant to industrial consumers who have punitive peak tariffs. And they're retrofitting batteries into the existing industrial processes. In some ways, it's a less risky avenue to go because unlike a new development where the kind of perception is around, this thing's not producing any income at the moment, so can it produce the income that's going to be needed to pay for this? With existing industrial processes, you've got track record, so you're making it more efficient, you're reducing the cost over time, and so from a financing point of view, it may be even more attractive than the new development model. And it's a kind of horses for courses thing, is using technology intelligently to make processes efficient. As soon as you do that, from a financing perspective, it works better.
Now, maybe also just to add to the part of the embedded generation, the question from Energy Partners. I mean, Nedbank is looking at the embedded space, and we are actively also having a number of projects which we have financed. But our approach is more from a commercial perspective to be more risk averse. And what we do is we look at projects which are already been built and are generating, and then we pull these assets together and determine what the revenue flows would be from all these different type of rooftop PVs. So, I mean, we're not in the business to support the developers with development funding to put these together. And at this stage also we're a bit hesitant to fund the construction of these rooftop PVs. But as soon as these are operating and have even a small number of history, a few months in terms of seeing what the operations are, we do a full due diligence, we pull these together, and then we give an overall funding package, which can be used then to roll out more and more projects for these embedded generation developers.
Good. I'm not sure we quite covered, we touched on some of the lessons from other sectors. Farai?
Yes, Wendy, I think there was a question on financing tenures. In terms of battery versus, for example, transmission lines. And I guess it's just really the reflection of how much the lenders do understand batteries at this point. And as the market finances more of these projects, and indeed the participation of DFIs, which are willing to take a greater level of risk than commercial banks, I think perhaps you start finding that the tenors that are allowed by the investors or by the financiers will increase over time. Yeah. But I think it's just the stage of development in terms of battery technology.
Thanks. Let us...
maybe
go ahead.
Two remarks to the gentleman from India. Did quite understand your question, but for me, India is an excellent example of what gradual market liberalization can do to stimulate investments. That's what we lack in Africa. I mean, our markets are, still dominated by monopolistic suppliers with no open grid access, no possibility to wheel. So the India example, I think, is a good learning. To the gentleman from Energy Partners. So if you look at this wider opportunity of commercial and industrial PV plus battery business, so we are also asking ourselves the question, is this a market which is going to be driven by equipment supplier who essentially sell the kit to a property developer and then it's financed as part of the mortgage? Or is it going to be off balance sheet through energy service providers who then also maintain that equipment and obtain financing on their balance sheet? I think we see both models in the market. It depends a bit on the preference of the client. Some people wouldn't want to be bothered with the maintenance and all that and want it off balance sheet. Other people would, are excited to own the panels on their rooftop. I think it's a specific expertise to maintain combined battery plus PV systems, and property owners don't necessarily have that. So I think there's a big advantage to outsource this, and I do think that there is a market developing for so-called aggregators. So people essentially who bundle many of these opportunities, small-scale commercial and industrial business, financed largely by equity, growth capital, and then come to the market once they have the portfolio and refinance it. I think that's an interesting opportunity. But we all, us as infrastructure financiers, we need to do a mind shift from our project finance minds to a more, entrepreneurial and commercially driven industry. I think we are nowhere near to non-recourse project finance models for battery applications. I think we need to look at this largely with the eyes of growth capital provision, so through equity, and then possibly corporate refinancings once assets are there, so more corporate style financing.
Good.
Good morning. Mark Higgins. I am from Stratogen in California and also have spent a lot of time working with the California Energy Storage Alliance and am on the steering committee of the Australian Energy Storage Alliance. So I've had a chance to see a lot of what's been happening in some of the markets that have been the early adopters of storage technology. And I guess a couple of comments and then a question. First, I wanted to say I really appreciate, Ricardo, what you said about it being very important to create the right regulatory environments and frameworks first to make sure that investments in the storage space are valued appropriately and that you're mitigating all the risk associated with energy storage. And an observation I've actually had from the U.S. is that perhaps somewhat counterintuitively, the markets that have made the most progress on storage have been the markets that have moved towards technology-neutral evaluation frameworks, integrated resource planning, and thinking about how do we evaluate technology from highest net benefit standpoint rather than just the lowest cost solution, because I think cost is almost universally the biggest question that's on people's minds about energy storage. Well, it's really expensive. How am I going to pay for that? Well, when you look at it, when you flip that on its head and look at it more from a what's actually going to provide the most value to society and to the grid standpoint, and you actually create the framework that allows you to stack benefits and say, well, what's my core use case, but then how do I actually do other things that would also be useful to the grid? You may end up with a different solution than you would if you were just looking at lowest cost. So that's just an observation. And a question, though, too, is that as the procurement structures evolve to look at things more from a technology-neutral standpoint, you actually end up often getting baskets of solutions from those where you have, maybe you have some storage being procured here, some new transmission here, you have some supply-side solutions, you have some demand-side solutions, you have microgrids. How does that fit into your overall thinking about the storage program and the type of work that World Bank's going to be doing in this space if you may end up with these sort of mixed solution sets and these baskets of solutions or microgrids that are actually the most useful solution, which actually here in Africa I think will be, as rural electrification and bringing power to places that don't have it right now, could actually be one of the highest and best uses of energy storage. But that requires a basket solution rather than a technology-specific solution. I'm just curious where that fits in with the overall thinking with this, the energy storage program.
Let's take maybe a couple more.
My name is Mike Mkaenda from ESCOM Malawi. My question is on the what Ricardo said on the way we can accelerate the deployment of the batteries. I feel not much is being done by the World Bank. You outlined the solutions to say that you enhance the supply of the batteries through subsidies, as well as the I don't know what other means, I have forgotten the other means which I've said, but actually what I'm trying to drive at is if the World Bank can facilitate and fast track the technological advancement in the research and development, that would enhance the reduction of the costs of the batteries, because the fact that the battery costs is high in terms of in the regions, in the sub-Saharan regions, it would deter the acceleration of the deployment of the batteries. But if you invest in the research and development component, then we would see the reduction of the prices of the batteries, and it would be accessible to even the private partners as well as the grassroots. So that would accelerate the deployment of the batteries. Thank you.
Hi everybody, this is Mirko Molinari. I lead the commercial for energy storage in GE. So the question is about what is the perceived role of technology provider when it comes to financing. So to be more specific, in a more liberalized market, we see ourselves as supporting customer and developer in sharing merchant risk, for example, or secure additional revenue through technology. So in a monopolistic world, what is the thinking around it, and what is the role that we think we can play?
Thanks. Let's have one more and then go back to the panel. Okay. Yeah. Penny.
Good day. This is Pavan Governor from the IPP office speaking. A question to the panel. I think it builds on the last question, or the previous question from the gentleman from the US. Has anybody started thinking about how a PPA would be structured around a more system-orientated service delivery, i.e. the various services that the battery provides, black start capability, reserve margin, dispatchability in terms of capacity, and various other services that were mentioned. I think it was on Marcel's presentation. Has a PPA been created in that particular framework on a project finance basis?
Thank you. Okay, that's quite a interesting set of questions. I think there was a question on the role of R&D and whether the World Bank or others can accelerate that, or how we can help that to move forward to bring down costs. A question about the role of technology providers in financing. A very interesting question at the end about the PPAs around the whole service package, not just the one aspect of it. And a question, I think, to the World Bank, but probably also to African Development Bank, is around a basket of solutions to storage, not just selecting one particular technology. So I don't know, Ricardo, a couple of those are for you. You want to kick off?
First, I mean, and I will try to cover the question from the gentleman from the US and the gentleman here from Malawi. First of all, least cost, when I mentioned that, is more of an economic concept than a financial concept. So, and actually, your question and your statement are very, very welcome, because it is true. We, at the World Bank, we look very much at systems, and not only systems country by country, but we look actually at regional systems, because it's the only way to do it nowadays. Technologies are so quick that it would be really a kind of anti-historical to think country by country. But this cost for us is an economic concept which takes into account actually all kind of externalities. So when I mentioned to you that in Europe, it's an integrated solution of energy trading, partially conventional generation, and a combination of renewables and batteries, that solution was the least cost from economic viewpoint when you take into account both local and global externalities. And I think that's very, 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 very important, because at the end, that's really the long-term view. From a financial viewpoint, the financial least cost, if we may say, I have to say I fully agree with you. I mean, it is a matter of not only what is the least cost, which is a little bit dumb nowadays, but what is the best offer comparing both the cost and the services to be rendered. So I have to say, fully agree with you, and actually the example that I made in Europe fit into that. To the gentleman from Malawi, yes, that's what we are trying to do. I can assure you that the World Bank cannot do everything. I don't come from the World Bank, so I don't have much of a these kind of things, but I can assure you that we, and because I'm there, so I feel that we are part of the same institution. We do, I can assure you, a lot. I mean, for someone who comes from outside and think, come on, the World Bank, they're there, a lot of blah, blah, blah. Well, I can tell you there is a lot of money being put where our ideas are. So, and actually the facility that we are moving so quickly, it is really a facility of providing concessional financing in order to deploy as soon as possible the utilization of batteries. But when I talk about concessional financing, it's not only kind of long-term loans at a lower low maturity and low cost, but also credit enhancement instruments. The gentleman from India was talking about the difference between the maturity available in the market and what is the kind of period horizons of returns that many private investors would like to have. And that's something we can always try to bridge. I also always talk as World Bank Group. So Marcel will not need to kill me at the end of this conversation because this is the same group. So whenever you see MIGA, wherever you see IFC, wherever you see World Bank, it's all the same thing. So this is what we're doing. But before before you go to the point where you can use concessional financing to accelerate the deployment of batteries, you really need, in my opinion, above all, especially in Africa, to educate about the utilization of batteries, what are the benefits. And I think many of us touched on this point. And that also a little bit goes into the question of GE. So we are trying to educate, GE is trying to educate, it's in their own interest, ENGIE, if I may say. So I think this is all a work that is being done together.
Thanks, Ricardo. There are a few other questions. Disney? Yep.
Yeah, I'd like to just respond to the question around the PPA. I found it very, when I think of a PPA, it's a long-term offtake agreement where the revenue streams is designed to recover the capital costs as well as the returns to finance an asset that has a very, very long life. And you're now taking something like battery storage, where the value is more on the service side of the asset as opposed to the infrastructure side of the asset, where the value is flexibility, reliability, ease of deployment, shorter asset life. And we want to cobble a revenue stream into an agreement that is not quite suited to that particular type of asset. And I think we need to change our thinking as well around where we see and how we value, like the gentleman from California, and I completely echo what you mentioned, where we see the value of this technology. Storage has been around for a very long time. We heard yesterday hundreds of years, pump storage, large dam storage. And when I hear people say, well, battery could take over or replace 3,000 megawatt LNG facility, it tells me...
I didn't say that.
Good. You wonder if it will. Again, the way we're seeing storage from a battery perspective is almost in the same light that we see thermal power storage, a coal-fired power station. And once we start to do that, the language around PPAs, offtake agreements, project finance doesn't change. It doesn't adapt to what the technology offers and how that offering should indeed be valued.
I can just add something to the comments here. It's about this trade-off between the certainty of your revenue stream and the upside of the volatility. And so we've tended to focus on financing being, you've got to create the certainty around the revenue streams, and battery's got the stacked revenue profile. How do you do that? But it's also important to realize that from an equity investor's perspective, that stacking, the volatility within each of those elements may be the attraction of the investment. And it's to then look at those. The fact that it's got a stacked revenue stream, quite frankly, is nice and sexy, but it doesn't change the fundamentals, which is how much certainty is there around each of those elements, and that determines how much you can leverage it to kind of push up the returns to investors. And then the other side is how much volatility, how much risk can the investor take, and how much is that going to be. The more risk the investor takes, the more premium there's going to be on that element of the stack. And so getting that balance, it's going to be it's an interesting challenge. It doesn't change fundamentally how you finance it, but it does change your investigation and how you evaluate the risk in what you're financing, which makes it quite different in terms of technology. Can I pick up on the question of the technology suppliers? It talks to the same thing, which is, in a sense, the technology suppliers are victims of their own success. As the technology improves, the old technology becomes obsolete. And that question of how do you manage that obsolescence is a key role that the technology supplier can play. One is to say, we don't care which piece of technology you've got in there, we care about its performance. And if you can then underwrite the performance within the operating environment, or you can provide guarantees about upgrades and create opportunities for refinancing it when the technology is more efficient, and creating that secondary market. That's the secret to most of the big yellow goods markets, for instance, is the guys can afford to supply into those markets because there's an active secondary market for the technology. And you start to address those, it's a very traditional way of looking at it, but that underwriting the technology and then making sure that there's a way of sharing the efficiency as the technology improves are key places where technology suppliers, I think, can play a role in making things more efficient from a financing perspective.
Thanks, Greg. Any other comments on that? So we're getting close to the time, but we started a little bit late, so can we take one more, I think? Okay. Penny, yep.
Hello, it's Johannes Barker from Africa Greenco. In the light of the comments just made, which I think are very important, the stacked revenue profile, I would like to ask the question about timing. What you see, what does it mean as soon as possible? Because I think we should all be aware that batteries are much more complex in terms of their revenue model, in contrast to the usual PPA structures of renewables. And of course, the route to have change the regulatory framework is one, but it takes time. It won't happen overnight. And therefore, the question to the panel also regarding the financing structure, do you see the corporate financing route, or how it's about non-recourse if we're so far away? Because to the fact of the corporate financing, of course, this muddles a lot with other issues as well, and maybe puts away the spotlight a little bit of the technology, which in my opinion, or at least it sounds yesterday, is here. And the question is how far is the market in terms of monetarization models and financing structure? So if you could just give us an indication what your ideas about timing, that would be great. Thanks.
Thank you. Okay, good.
Hi.
Yeah. Let's just let Penny go. She tried 3 times now. Go ahead.
Hi. Yes. So Penny Herbs, also from Africa Greenco, and I think I'm just following on from my colleague's question. It was about this public versus private finance, you know, and I'm a bit confused about what it really means, because we talk about private sector finance, yet there's support from government behind the private sector projects. And I just want to raise the question. I mean, we've seen in South Africa, we've hit a fiscal ceiling. We've hit fiscal ceilings all around Africa. So what are the IFIs doing to address issues of fiscal ceiling? And I'd like to kind of use an analogy on myself as well as Desni was saying. You know, when I was younger, I went to try and buy a certain asset, and I got told that my balance sheet wasn't strong enough, and I should approach my parents for some security. So I went to see my father, and I spoke to him. He said, well, give me your statements, I'll have a look at it. And he said, there's no ways I'm signing security on this, right? and I had to wait another 2 or 3 years before I was able to buy what I wanted to buy, because I just wasn't able to afford it. So it comes back to kind of the question on due diligence by various financing institutions. To what extent do you really interrogate the fiscal space for this, and where do we have to move to have pure private sector finance? So for these, the Actises and the Global X that's standing up there, if regulation did change, would you be prepared to enter a market without the government support? Because it's what we need. We can't carry on the way we are. It's like Einstein said, you keep on doing the same thing but expecting a different result. We're not going to get a different result. So, and I'd love to hear your response, and perhaps some of the developers in the room. What do we need to get, doing things differently, fundamentally so? Thanks.
Thanks, Penny.
Yeah, thank you. I am Pablo from IRENA. I think we can all agree that interest for electricity sources all over the world has come to a high end now. But at the same time, I think I would like to echo on the regulatory frameworks. First of all, they are so diverse, and some countries are going, even those that are really ahead of the game, are struggling with some of the very same questions that you guys are discussing today. We see, you mentioned the case of Europe. Even in Europe, only recently a proper definition of electricity storage was introduced, like I think 1 year ago. So in this so-called winter package. And I'm just thinking, okay, this regulatory environment is a constant state of flux, I would say. And how do you guys approach this? We talked about multiple revenue streams and everything, but the regulatory is ever changing, and sometimes it's even too slowly adapting to what needs to be done, right? So, but how do you guys see it from your financing perspective? How to address that? Yeah, Ashley.
Good morning. Good morning, Ashley Singh from Aquapower. I'd like to bring to the panel's attention the name of the conference. It says Batteries, Energy Storage, and the Renewable Future. So there's a whole energy storage component there. I certainly am not an advocate of CSP with thermal energy storage. We're a technology agnostic company. But I'd like to hear from the panel in terms of your viewpoint in future funding of CSP with thermal energy storage. Thank you.
I'm Winnie Stewart, Principal Secretary in the Ministry of Natural Resources and Energy, as I stated yesterday. I've got just one question to the World Bank. The country has got a potential of generating 40 megawatts from solar PV and 40 megawatts from biomass through wood chips or bagasse. And the study has proved to this effect. So this will be thrown in the media for the independent power producers, that this is okay. But then His Majesty, from his speech from the throne in January this year, he emphasized that the ministry should be able to generate power because 80% of our power is from the Republic of South Africa. So the ministry has been tasked to generate more power because the country is in shortage of 300 megawatts in total. So my minister is pushing very hard. The new government started in October last year, and they will be exiting in October 2023. He said he doesn't even want to count 2023. He only counts his service up to 2022. So the ministry in 2016 signed an MOU with the Republic of Mozambique to pipe a gas line from Mozambique to Eswatini. So I don't know if the World Bank does offer or support on funding when we need a gas from the Republic of Mozambique. From Mozambique to the Kingdom of Eswatini, it's about 148 kilometers. So we need to know if World Bank can assist the country to either assist an independent power producer or assist on funding with our Eswatini electricity company so that we can be able to construct the energy or the gas plant in the country through piping it from the Republic of Mozambique. And this is a matter of urgency because my minister needs this to be done in 3 or 4 years to come. And it's a must. So I want to know if a World Bank can be able to assist us in this development. Thank you.
Any other questions? I think that's good. So let's, we have got quite a wide range there. Let me just go perhaps panelist by panelist, since this is the last version, if you would like to respond to any of the questions and any other thoughts that you want to add at this point. Anybody like to volunteer to start?
Should I start?
Go ahead, Marcel, thank you.
I leave the tricky one for Ricardo. To Ashley, CSP. So we are of the view that CSP, concentrated solar power with thermal storage, so molten salt, is a very valuable technology option. Cannot be compared to batteries because the sheer size of storage you can provide through thermal or molten salt storage is so much bigger. So the projects in South Africa have up to 10, 12 hours of storage. So this is a valuable option. But contrary to PV and wind, the costs of concentrated solar power have not come down as much. And particularly, this has not been demonstrated in South Africa, that these costs of CSP plus thermal storage have come down so much. It has been demonstrated in other parts of the world, like in the United Arab Emirates, where CSP is now selling with storage at around 8 cents. No? Ashley, correct me? 7, huh? Which is not so bad, right? So if I go out on a limb here a little bit, I do think that South Africa should consider CSP plus thermal storage as one of its options to decarbonize. It has qualities which PV and wind don't have, and if correctly procured, or procured in a fashion which, takes into account the specific benefits of CSP, also in South Africa, the prices can come down. So when I say correctly procured, I mean CSP should not be only given a 20-year PPA. CSP should be given a longer PPA because the technology's life is longer. CSP should not be procured in 50 megawatt batches. It should be procured in 300, 400 megawatt batches per plant. CSP should not be constrained to only dispatch between 8 o'clock in the morning and 9 o'clock in the evening. It should also be able to dispatch during the night, and it can actually even be dispatchable power called upon by the utility. So if all of this works, this can be a very valuable option for South Africa, and South Africa should consider to continue CSP. To non-recourse financing for batteries. So we are at IFC certainly looking at financing, maybe as a test case or as a first case, a combined PV plus battery solution. As Ricardo mentioned, we are trying this in Madagascar. There are leads in other countries, and so this would be classic project finance. And the PPA is not that complicated. The load shifting part of the PPA is simple, right? It's an energy component arbitrage. What is more complex if you want to stack revenues into various other services But there, you know, the way we're going to go for now, we should do this through availability payments. So that, unless or until we have more sophistication and the utilities, you know, in a liberalized market can procure those services separately, that's what we will be confined to, availability payments only. I stop there.
Okay, I go. First of all, on the question on the midstream project concerning LNG, I'm afraid to tell you, I don't have an answer to give you. I don't know the project, and I think the best thing in this kind of project is for the government, the World Bank Group, I always mean, but also private partners to have a discussion to see what is the economic and financial viability, and we take it from there. I can give you a very general answer that the World Bank does finance midstream gas projects all over the world. I'm thinking about the Caucasus in this moment, it comes to my mind, but you know, I mean, for me it's impossible to give an answer to your question without knowing the project and all these things. On the question about timing, I mean, I would like to know the time myself. The truth is that you say, what's the timing? You talk about accelerating, doing quick in the market. Which market? I mean, there are markets that are very prepared to develop their policies in a quick way. They understand, they have utilities that understand the technology. They have private investors that trust the market as a whole and are ready to take a little bit more of, let's say, call it technology risk in a quite safe market environment. So it depends from market to market. And I think that expectations should be earmarked to the maturity of the market. The question from the lady in the first row, I think there is a little bit of confusion here on words, to be perfectly honest. Public and private finance. Public and private meaning what? Is it the source of financing? So the source of financing from a DFI, or development financial institutions, is considered as public. From a private company, being a bank or being an equity investor or other, is considered as private. Then you have the gray area, which is the utility which is state-owned but is commercially run. Is it public or private? But I think that your question is more about the usage of the fiscal space within a government. I do understand it, but I wanted to tell you, words count. They really do count. And of course, the bank always, I'm sure our colleagues at African Development Bank, and I'm sure our colleagues in the private sector do the same, they always look at what is the fiscal space. Can the government afford this? Or are we going to have structures that at the end are not sustainable from a public fiscal space viewpoint? We will always prefer that the private sector does the investments, does things. I think that's what we would prefer, because I do think that the private sector is more efficient than the public in general. That doesn't mean it's always the case, but in the vast majority of cases. Then we consider always the fiscal space. But remember, these are kind of questions that are in their form, they don't address the complexity of the question, because it is in the sovereign space to decide what to do with the fiscal space. It's not about the World Bank to say what, or the IMF or whatever, to say what you can do with your fiscal space. Of course, we always look, in our case, to sustainability, economic and financial sustainability. We look, of course, environmental and social, but this is not the point. We look whether the money is going to have an economic return when we work with public money. We do that. But of course, we are also limited with what is the sovereign will. Sometimes we say no, we don't want to do it, but that doesn't mean that the sovereign cannot do it. They will do whatever they think it is the best for their own country. So I think this is If the answer is, do you look at this? Yes, we do. Do you have deep due diligence? Yes, we do. We know always what is the public space. So, but then, decisions can be different.
Thank you. Roy, go ahead.
Yeah, perhaps I could just continue on the last comments made by Ricardo. And Penny, I'm not quite too sure if this is meant specifically for AFDB or in general, whether it's for us or in general. Why I say this is, look, I think there are instances where private sector projects have gone ahead without the need for government guarantees. And this is really because, for example, the off-taker is strong enough. This is because the regulatory environment is very clear on a number of issues. And I can just quickly point out to Namibia, in terms of my understanding. I think in the last year or so, they've done close to 130 megawatts of renewable energy without the need for government guarantee. And they have another, more or less the same, megawatts that are also going in without government guarantee. So it's possible, and indeed, for all the reasons that he stated, right, it's possible for the lenders to go ahead without insisting on a government guarantee. But to get to that level, there's also perhaps a trade-off. If, for example, you look at Namibia, they then also have the highest tariff of all the countries in the region. So perhaps there's a trade-off that one also needs to consider, but it is indeed possible. Funding for Ashley, coming back to Ashley, I think for the African Development Bank, again, it's one of those things, CSP with storage, we would be interested in looking at a CSP with storage project. Again, it's about, at the end of the day, what is that final tariff? What does it look like? Does it represent anything close to list cost? I think in terms of how we have funded CSP to date, because we look at list cost as a very, for us, it's one of those things that we must prove as part of our due diligence. And our participation in CSP has been to try and then bring in concessionary funds, for example, from the Clean Technology Fund, to try and bring down that cost of the final, in terms of the tariff at the end of the day. So that's how we have funded CSP to date, and we are hoping that with the continued technological improvements, it won't be necessary for us to go ahead and look, to consider all these concessionary resources where we do assist. So yes, we are interested, and we will be looking at that we will look at that as an option. Thank you.
Thanks. Mitch?
Okay, just in short, to end off, firstly, in terms of CSP, Nedbank's view of CSP, we have been supportive of most of the CSP projects in the renewable energy space in South Africa and co-funded most of those deals. And we must remember that CSP at this stage is a commercial technology with low technology risks, and the learning curve is already happening. I mean, in terms of battery storage, we still need to see whether there's a lot of projections in terms of the learning curve and cost reductions, while CSP is already in that curve, and we can actually see projects being implemented, how the tariffs come down. And as far as Nedbank is concerned, CSP is one of the better technologies to obviously combine with energy storage in terms of the molten salt, and to shift to the peak generation. Just in a few closing comments on the PPA, we all look at the renewable energy PPA as being a general PPA. We must remember solar and wind PPAs are self-dispatch PPAs, as we call them. So from a funding perspective, it's actually easy to determine what the risk is, and to just determine what the credit rating of the off-taker is. On battery storage, it's a bit more complex. The revenue streams, revenue stacking, as we indicated, are not that simple. So, I mean, a simple project finance 101 approach would be to look at battery storage to have a kind of availability or capacity charge, which will be paid by the user, which would cover most of the debt, and then see the revenue stacking or the additional revenue streams as an upside for the equity guys. But there's a big but on that, because there's not a lot of visibility from a technical perspective currently to see what these revenue streams impact would be on the longevity of the batteries in terms of the different cycles, on how they will be called, on frequencies, and on different revenue streams, to see what the technical impact would be. So we would most probably look at the OEMs to see in terms of what the typical load profile of those batteries would be, and get guarantees behind them going forward.
Thanks. Disney, and then Greg.
Thanks, Wendy. I think I'm going to close out by responding to Penny's question. One has to ask the question, Penny, why isn't there fiscal space left? Farai mentioned Namibia. Namibia today is able to procure power without a government PPA because it moved. It moved from Kudu gas, which for 25 years the government was promoting as the energy solution for the country. Once it moved from that to renewable energy, smaller scale, very quickly to implement, low impact on the fiscus, the country has very quickly been able, in a space of 12, 18 months, to procure as much as 140 megawatts. So I think there also needs to be a recognition that renewable energy storage and battery, it offers this continent an opportunity to very, very quickly implement solutions that are affordable from not just the perspective of per megawatt hours, the tariff, because that's all we focus on. We don't focus on the opportunity cost to the economy of not having that power while we embark on a 2,400 megawatt hydropower project in 2 countries that will remain unnamed, but I think everybody knows what I'm talking about. And unfortunately, this is the reality. You look at the country's power sector master plans. That's what you see. Very, very large, certainly in Southern Africa, very, very large hydropower projects for which there is no fiscal space to support. Technology gives us an amazing opportunity. We need to embrace it. And in embracing it, we need to indeed create the regulatory environment. But the environment has to be, the regulation needs to be technology agnostic. We have to regulate around solutions because the technology is evolving. It's evolving far more faster than probably regulations can keep up with. So we need to regulate around opportunities, around solutions, rather than get hung up on the actual technology of the day.
Thank you. Greg, last word.
Just one last comment. Yes, I just want to add something, going right back to the beginning, something Marcel said. He said South Africa has installed 180 megawatts of rooftop. That's in the last year. Our stats are showing that that's the average for the last 3 years. So those numbers are actually are becoming very real in terms of a comparison to large-scale utility installations. Technology is changing how we think about power generation. Distributed generation is becoming increasingly competitive with large-scale utilities, and it's a change that is happening very fast at the moment, and so storage talks into the space very strongly. And there's no question that, from a financing point of view, once we can get our mind around distributed generation, distributed access to power, however you want to look at it, these things are actually quite simple because it's perception. Once you break the perception that you have to have a big telecommunications utility with fixed lines and replace it with mobile, once people start using it, it becomes normal. And we're seeing that kind of, in a sense, the normal in power is going to become distributed generation. And everything that allows that as an integrated system, smart regulation, storage, more efficient technology, that's all happening. And 2-3 years down the line, it's going to be completely normal. This is what we finance. And we're seeing it as, it's just, this is how it happens. It's not anything unusual about it. And the sooner we can do that, the less we get kind of bogged down in, we have to find new models.
Thank you. Time to close. So I would say, first of all, thank you very much to all the panelists. It's been really fantastic, and thanks to the audience for really interesting questions. I must say that a few of the questions in the last round really feed in very nicely to the afternoon session on policy and regulations. So I think some of those will be picked up in a little bit more detail there again. But just thanks very much to everybody. Yep.